Hi, everybody. Meteorologist Brian Bennett. Here's your latest update for Sunday, October 7th. All right, so what has changed over the past 24 hours? Well, one, the storm has become better organized. It is now a tropical storm with winds of 40 miles per hour. Two, the forecast path has shifted eastward just a tad. And three, the storm is expected to become stronger than what some of the models were calling for yesterday. We are now expecting a hurricane at landfall, most likely in the Florida Panhandle, though the cone of uncertainty does extend from Cedar Key, Florida to Mobile, Alabama. Looking at the infrared satellite imagery, again, you can see the storm is much better organized than it was this time yesterday. And again, just to get your bearings here, here's Florida right here, and the Yucatan Peninsula is over here. The storm is much more symmetric than it was this time yesterday. So definitely a bona fide tropical system. Looking at the visible imagery, you can see that the storm is weighted much heavier with much more convection on the eastern side of the storm, likely representing perhaps a little bit of wind shear, also encountering perhaps a little bit of friction from the Yucatan Peninsula. But nonetheless, we are looking at a decent counterclockwise circulation. We're also looking at some of the upper cirrus shield clouds kind of spewing off to the northeast. All of this representing a somewhat organized system, and it's only going to become more organized once it gets out into the warm and unobstructed waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The Hurricane Reconnaissance aircraft is actually flying through the storm at this moment, and it just found winds actually in some of the convective bursts upwards of around 60 miles per hour or so. So I wouldn't be surprised if, as of the next update from the Hurricane Center, if the sustained winds would increase a little bit from that 40 mile per hour mark, since they are seeing some stronger winds in the storm, but very likely to still be a tropical storm and not of hurricane status. All right, so what's going to control where this storm goes? Well, a lot of that is about this high pressure system that is basically taking up much of the eastern part of the country. The high pressure here in this reddish color here, the tropical system here in this blue color. And going back in time to right now, you can see that we have a pretty strong high pressure system. The European actually has that high pressure system strengthening a little bit, and if it remained this strong, then the tropical system would likely go straight into Mississippi or even Louisiana, but that's not going to be the case. The high pressure system is going to weaken, and as it does weaken, it's going to allow the tropical system to make a turn to the northeast, more towards perhaps the Panhandle or even the Big Bend area. How quickly the high pressure deteriorates and how quickly the storm moves north will control exactly who gets impacted the most on the Florida Panhandle. But again, you can kind of see how once that high pressure system diminishes, then that storm system starts to curve off to the northeast like it naturally wants to do, with the Coriolis force kind of dragging it to the northeast. All right, so here's a look at the future radar. And as we go through time, you can see the center of the storm is expected to be due west of Tampa by later Wednesday afternoon and Wednesday evening. The worst conditions for the Florida Panhandle likely to be late Wednesday night and into Thursday morning. And then the storm continues to move off to the northeast through Georgia and the Carolinas. All right, so how much rain are we talking about? These are the rainfall totals according to the European computer model. And where the center of circulation makes landfall, which right now the European model is kind of honing in on the Apalachicola area, then we would see rainfall totals upwards of around 12 inches, perhaps a foot of rain. Not nearly as much rain in the Florida Peninsula if the storm stays in this track. If it shifts eastward a bit more, then we'll get some of those outer rain bands and see more rain in the peninsula. And the same thing vice versa goes. If the storm were to go farther west, then greater rainfall totals would occur to the west as well. The storm's then going to go off to the northeast. We know a lot of rain has fallen in this area of the Carolinas over the last month or so due to the previous hurricane that moved through. And it looks like this area is going to pick up an additional 3 to 6 inches of rain. So not a devastating amount of rain, but enough that it could make the rivers perhaps swell a little bit, and obviously not something that's welcome when folks are trying to get their lives and their homes back in order after the recent hurricane. All right, what about winds? Here's a look at the projected winds from the European computer model, and you can see the storm making landfall perhaps Wednesday night, Thursday morning, and the European actually suggesting a wind gust on the order of about 115 miles per hour around the Apalachicola area. So very strong winds possible with this strong Cat 1 hurricane, maybe even a lower end Cat 2 hurricane as it makes landfall in the Florida Panhandle. But just know that there is a little bit of uncertainty with this and a little bit of wiggle room. This could move a little bit east, or it could move a little bit west. So anybody basically from northern Tampa Bay, especially Cedar Key area and areas around the Big Bend all the way over to Mobile, needs to keep a really close eye on this storm system. Folks in the Panhandle should be preparing for a hurricane to be moving on shore, especially if you live anywhere from about the Florida Big Bend area to about the Destin area, because that looks to be the most likely area. And actually, speaking of, I'd like to show you this little graphic that I made here. I think it's pretty useful because it shows you 11 different computer models that I have access to, and also the official track from the National Hurricane Center. The European model, which is perhaps my most trusted model, has a storm moving ashore in the Carabel, Florida area. And the Icon model, the German model, does a very good job. It has it making landfall in the Apalachicola area. The National Hurricane Center, of course, has it making landfall just east of Panama City. GFS does a pretty stable job, and that's just west of Panama City. And let's see what else. We got the H-Wharf here, which can do pretty well also, and that's basically the very western tip of the Florida Panhandle. So bottom line is, we've seen the models come together quite a bit over the past 24 hours. We've seen the models, for the most part, shift farther eastward, but we also still see a bit of uncertainty in exactly what city will be impacted the most, and a shift to the east or west of even 20 to 30 miles can make a huge difference in who is impacted the most by this tropical system. Again, forecast winds by the models expected to be generally a Cat 1 hurricane as it makes landfall. That could change a little bit as well, so that's something we'll have to pay pretty close attention to. All right, this is something pretty cool here. This shows you the maximum forecast winds expected by the European computer model, and you can see that the Florida Panhandle, right around Apalachicola, based on the latest European run, is expecting possibly wind gusts of around 115 miles per hour. Head a little bit farther west to around Panama City, and based on this exact trajectory, then Panama City would actually be dodging a bullet with maximum wind gust on the order of about 60 to 70 miles per hour, and then winds not as strong down in the Florida Peninsula either. But again, this will wiggle back and forth a little bit before the storm actually makes landfall. Just to show you, the previous European computer model had the strongest winds moving right over Panama City. Again, here's a previous run. Here's this run 12 hours later. So you can see how just between 12-hour runs that the forecast is shifting. Not a ton, but enough that it could greatly or dramatically impact one area versus another on the Florida Panhandle. So it is something we'll have to watch pretty closely as the storm gets more defined. Again, based on the latest computer model, the latest European model, Apalachicola area would be experiencing wind gusts on the order of about 115 miles per hour. And even southern Georgia and even into the Carolinas. You know what? Let's go back to that previous graphic, and just to show you that we could see wind gusts on the order of perhaps 60 miles per hour all the way up through the Carolinas. One caveat with this being a faster moving system is that the stronger wind gusts could make their way farther inland. A slower system, of course, would drop more rainfall, kind of like we had with Harvey, where we had 50 inches of rain. This is not going to be a Harvey. We're not going to see 50 inches of rain, but we are going to see the potential for a foot of rain, and we're also going to see the potential for some damaging winds making their way pretty far inland, even into the Carolinas, which is pretty far inland from where it's initially going to make landfall. All right, the Tampa Bay area and the Florida Peninsula, based on the current forecast track, could experience on the area beaches winds gusting to, let's say, about 40-45 miles per hour. Again, if this track were to shift eastward a little bit, those winds would dramatically increase. But based on the current track, wind gusts in Pinellas County down through Fort DeSoto and up through parts of Homosassa and any coastal areas would be seeing wind gust on the order of about 40 to 45 miles per hour. Get inland and the wind gust really not a great concern. You have enough friction from land and the trees to reduce any extremely gusty conditions. Taking a look at these spaghetti model plots for the forecast intensity, and you can see that the models do have a little bit more confidence in a stronger storm than they did this time yesterday. Most of the models are predicting a Cat 1 hurricane at landfall. I wouldn't be shocked if this even could nudge into the Cat 2 category status. So magnitude of a storm is something that these models really don't have a great grasp on as far as the technology nowadays. So right now they're forecasting a Cat 1 at landfall, but that's something we'll have to pay pretty close attention to as we continue to get more model data. All right, so what are some of the limiting factors that could control how strong the storm becomes? Well, one would be water temperature. That's not going to be a problem because the Gulf is plenty warm enough. We've had record heat in September, so the Gulf will be warm enough to sustain a hurricane. The potential second factor would be limiting moisture. Well, as the storm goes into the Gulf of Mexico, the air is actually going to remain moist enough so that moisture or lack of moisture is not going to be a limiting factor with this storm. As it approaches landfall, we do get some dry air moving in, and if this dry air were to entrain into the center of the storm, it would weaken it a little bit, but right now the European model is saying that's not going to happen, that the storm will make landfall before the dry air has a chance to wrap around the storm and to actually weaken it. What about wind shear? That would be a third potential factor that could weaken or perhaps result in a stronger storm. So if this storm system were to move north at this exact moment, it would be sheared into a million pieces by all of this wind shear over the Gulf of Mexico. But watch what happens. As time progresses, you see less reds. That means that there's less wind shear. So as the storm gets into the Gulf, it's actually going to be a more favorable environment for the storm system to develop. And that's one of the reasons I think we'll be dealing with a hurricane shortly after the storm gets off the Yucatan Peninsula. As the wind shear is going to die down, we'll have warm enough water temperatures, we'll have abundant moisture. The Hurricane Center doesn't have it becoming a hurricane until it gets close to landfall. I think that's going to happen sooner. I think that'll be once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. And wind shear, not really too much of a problem as it moves off to the north. We do have quite a bit of wind shear moving down once it starts to make landfall. So that could make the storm a little lopsided as it makes landfall, but not enough to greatly reduce its intensity. So overall, pretty favorable environment for the storm system to develop and remain a decent storm, at least a Cat 1 hurricane as it makes landfall. So storm surge, the most deadly part of a hurricane. What are we looking at based on storm surge? Well, based on the current track, which the National Hurricane Center has moving just a couple of miles east of Panama City Beach, we would be looking at about 7-foot storm surge in the Big Bend area. So pretty sizable storm surge in this area just south of Crawfordville, southwest of Perry, and right around the Carabel area would be seeing storm surge right around 5 feet. If the Hurricane Center track is 100% correct, then Panama City Beach would be dodging a bullet because the largest storm surge is going to be on the eastern or the right quadrant of a storm. So good news based on this path. If the storm were to shift even 30 miles farther west, then suddenly Panama City is dealing with a much larger storm surge. Based on the current track, Panama City Beach is looking at roughly about a 2-foot storm surge, make the center of the hurricane go a bit farther west and perhaps make landfall in Destin. Then Panama City is looking at the potential for about a 4 or 5 or maybe even a 6-foot storm surge out of this hurricane. So the exact landfall location is going to be crucial to determining who gets the worst weather out of this hurricane. And this will become a little bit more clear as we move through time, and especially once we get a defined center of circulation out of the hurricane, which will be coming over the next 24 to 36 hours. All right, what impact will this have on red tide? Well, the Panhandle area has been experiencing red tide this summer and early fall. I think that the hurricane could actually totally eradicate red tide in the Panhandle area over the coming days after the hurricane strikes. The winds and the waves will be enough to really stir this up and probably get rid of red tide, at least temporarily, in this area. What about the area in southwest Florida that's been experiencing red tide for a long time? Well, Unfortunately, I think that the hurricane could actually make conditions worse. We're going to have a south to southwest flow, and that's going to drag a lot of nutrients, a lot of the Carina brevis that are down around the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River. It's going to drag a lot of that to the north, just like we had with Tropical Storm Gordon. So it could actually make things worse for the long term for Manatee, Sarasota, and even Pinellas County. And what about the east coast of Florida? Well, this area is going to continue to see a pretty strong easterly flow, so conditions will continue to remain less than ideal on the east coast of Florida with that easterly flow, because that's going to bring the Carina brevis ashore, as it's been doing really with that persistent easterly wind over the past couple of weeks, and that's going to likely continue. So not really much of an impact to this area because we're not expecting much of a change in winds. Perhaps again a little bit worse after the tropical system for the southwest Florida area and possibly eradicating the red tide for the Panhandle area. All right, so that's the latest on what's expected to happen with Matthew. It's definitely a storm that we want to keep a close eye on. It's likely going to be a hurricane as it makes landfall, most likely in the Florida Panhandle. Power outages, trees down will pretty much be a likelihood in this area of the Florida Panhandle. It's going to be a pretty quick moving storm though, so again that's going to bring some damaging winds on shore, but it will mean that the storm will move in and move out pretty quickly. All right guys, that's it for now. Again, as I mentioned, I'm going to make an entirely different video on what I expect to happen with the red tide, but this is a bottom line of what's going to be happening with the tropical system as it makes landfall. All right, thank you for watching.